Welcome back. The recent shooting on Republican members of Congress has reflected partisanship in a new light. While Republicans and Democrats are calling for unity in the shooting's wake, it brings up the specter of violence stemming from political rhetoric. We saw clashes between protesters and police at campaign rallies last year, and even during President Donald Trump's inauguration. So does heated political rhetoric contribute to violence? Joining us to tackle this question, a panel of political observers. In our Raleigh studio, conservative commentator Chad Adams, host of The Chad Adams Show. In our Charlotte newsroom, former Democratic State Senator Malcolm Graham. And in our Greensboro newsroom, Professor Roy Schwartzman, a political communications expert at UNC Greensboro. Gentlemen, good to see you. Welcome back to the program. Malcolm, let's start with you. You're the former elected official on this panel. We had a reporter that was body slammed in Montana. We had the Scalise shooting, Kathy Griffin holding up a picture of Trump's head, or basically a fake Trump head. And in Georgia, there were reports of people being scared going to political events because of potential violence. Do you think this is sort of at a worse place that we've ever seen with this, or no?
Well, I've been following, been a student of government since in my early teens, and I've never seen the political environment so intense where the Republicans are really far right and the Democrats are really far left, and there doesn't seem to be a middle ground. The way the elected officials on both parties, Democrats and Republicans, talk about one another, talk about the issues, really tears people apart and doesn't bring people together. And I remember, again, as a young student following government, and there was compromise and bipartisanship were words that were used very often, and now it's win at all costs. And unfortunately, and again, both parties are guilty of this at times. They tend to put the party over country.
Chad, you host a radio show. Have you noticed a difference in sort of the tone of callers over the period of years?
First, let me remind you, I was an elected official before.
You were too, you're right, I'm sorry.
But having said that, no, I think the rhetoric, what I've seen, and I don't want it to sound as partisan as it's going to sound, but what I see out there is a lot of pot shots over policy. You know, and we had 30 congressional members that were Republicans that have had death threats in some way since May 1st. I mean, you had the shooting, you had the beheading situation with Kathy Griffin, you had the Shakespearean play. Reverend Barber, people forget this, the day before that shooting called every member of the General Assembly that was a Republican criminal and basically a racist. So the elevation in the discussion, and I guess it's frustration, and I see you saw that in the Charlotte riots, the frustration from people is turning into something that's not allowing us to have really good debates. Malcolm, I appreciate working with Malcolm because we discuss policy, and it's not about just taking pot shots at the other side, but there's been an elevation of acceptable violence and rancor that really is not acceptable at all.
Professor Schwartzman, how do we get to the point where it is really bad language to where we're getting to shootings and images of a beheaded president?
Well, I think that the quality of language is both a reflection of and a shaper of the quality of thought and the range of acceptable action, that is the things that people consider as legitimate. By the way, let's not forget Johnny Depp's veiled assassination threats as well, just to add on to the quality of discourse. I see this fundamentally as a systemic problem that basically what's happened with the discourse is a reflection of what's happening on a larger level in society, and that is a shrinkage of the ability of people to embrace, practice, and talk about ways of coping with problems and challenges in ways other than all or nothing, us and them, winners and losers types of thought processes. So I see a hardening of a two-dimensional type of thinking that really makes it a lot easier to resort to extreme tactics, be those rhetorical tactics or be those physical violence. And let me point out that there is no bright line between those. Where you find one, you will often find the other because they feed into each other.
Malcolm, we even see this in the state. I talked to Speaker Moore not long ago. He's talking about more security at the legislature because he and other Republican members of the state legislature have received death threats in the past year or two as well. What do you think is the solution on this? I know you want people to work together more, but we seem to be headed in the other direction.
It's such a tough question that you just asked. Hopefully we could elect more statesmen and women, those who are interested in solving public policy issues and problems versus being a winner. I wish I had the answer. It's very tough. My last term in the state Senate, we tried to negotiate and work with the Republican Party, and I saw it from both ends. I was in the majority party, I was in the minority party when I was in the state senate, and I always said just because you could don't mean that you should. And sometimes I believe the majority parties take it to the extremes in terms of their language and their rhetoric, whether the majority party is the Democrat or the Republican Party. And somehow we have to find that common ground, that middle ground where folks can come together and find a compromise.
But that's blaming the politicians for the violence put on them. I mean, when you have Madonna saying, "I dream of blowing up the White House," the rhetoric from the left, and I get it, it's been a frustrating election cycle. Democrats find themselves on their heels across the country. That frustration, if you can't make a point without getting arrested, you've lost the argument. You really have. This sense of we must pound on the doors of legislators until we get arrested isn't making a point about a policy decision. It's not it's not about compromise anymore. It's about we want our way, and there's bullying tactics. I don't remember when the Tea Party had their massive protests across the country. They weren't getting arrested. They weren't committing crimes. They weren't setting cars on fire and blowing up Starbucks. This is a rhetorical time. I mean, CNN had to lay off reporters because they faked stories. This is real stuff that's happening, and it's an agitated left at this point in time. The people on the right are more fearful. They're scared.
You don't think President Trump agitated last year?
Sure, he does, but does that excuse it? If I say, I mean, that doesn't excuse the violence and the threats of violence. I think Malcolm would agree with that, wouldn't you, Malcolm?
I would agree that it's coming from both sides, the left.
Where are the 30 threats? Where are the hundreds of threats against Democrats?
You just look at the way the president campaigned for a year and the rhetoric that he espoused, and saying that they should drag people out of his rally, and people were being hit at his rally. Again, I think there's
people were disrupting his rally. They weren't doing it to Hillary Clinton's rally.
There's enough blame to go around for everybody. And again, if we play this blame game, then we're not going to get closer to the middle.
Professor Schwartzman, I have to ask you, since I have you on tonight, just a totally different subject, unfortunately, a weird transition, but this idea of not putting the press briefings on camera in Washington, why do you think the White House wants to do that? Is there a strategic reason behind that?
Well, sure, there's a strategic reason, because this is a very familiar tactic that is usually used by authoritarian types of regimes to control the message. And obviously there is less of a chance of losing control of the message if you don't open it up to active, live, face-to-face participation and interaction. So the answer is yes, there's definitely a strategic reason, and it's a very simple one of controlling the message and basically envisioning the press or news organizations in general as conduits or mouthpieces of news, rather than a fourth estate, if you will, rather than a potential oppositional force. And of course, when you want to reduce the chance of oppositional voices, one of the most effective ways to do that historically is to attempt to marginalize or silence them, and that's precisely what it does.
The president believes that
you're more likely to get challenged if you are live with someone like these sorts of programs that we're on right now.
The president feels they're justified, obviously, with some of the things Chad said about CNN, and then a report of the Russia investigation of those 3 employees leaving. Resigned. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Great conversation. Hopefully we can continue it soon, because it's an important one. Thank you, gentlemen. That's it for tonight. Until next time, if it's on Jones Street or Main Street, you'll find it right here on Capitol Tonight. In the meantime, have a great evening.